Okay, welcome everybody to Après Midi. I am very pleased to introduce Mr. Daniel Tostado, immigration attorney extraordinaire, who will, of course, tell you all about what he does, who he is, and then you'll have a chance for a Q&A. So you probably all come with your lists of questions. Okay, don't get that excited. All right. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Adrian.
Okay, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Well, it's nice to make everybody.
Au centre.
Wonderful. It's nice to see you guys all in person. I already see a couple of my clients here, so I'm not sure what they're doing because they already know my spiel. But I am Daniel Tostado. I'm from San Diego, California initially, and I made the move to France 7 years ago because I decided that I have a French-shaped heart and I must be here living my best French life. And so I framed my way of going to law school so that I started with American law school, such that I would finish with French law school, and then sit for the New York bar, then sit for the French bar. And having gone through all those different machinations of figuring out how to navigate the student status and so forth, I started getting how it works. And then I realized that my best strength as an American that made it in France is to be having gone from the outsider into becoming an insider, is to help other people who also love France, who also want to make France their home, become insiders as well. So that's kind of the what I've gotten into. And so I've been doing this now for several years, and it's been a real pleasure because I kind of put myself into the shoes of my clients. And the other side of it is that American customer service, as Adrian could probably speak about. I've been in a couple of French firms, and the way that they might reply to a client or not reply to a client, and then you kind of have to do a follow-up. It's good to have somebody with the American smile that gets how the system works. So that's kind of my angle in all of this. So I'm happy to speak about French immigration, French naturalization, whatever you think is worthwhile for us to speak about today. Can we start with a little bit of a poll? Who here in this room has a visa or residency permit? Okay. So roughly a little bit more than half, maybe. Is anybody here gone full force and already become French?
Almost.
Okay, yeah. And we're working on that. Okay. Can you show a show of hands who wants to become French? Okay. Not everyone, but a good number of them. Okay, wonderful.
But Daniel.
Yeah.
You can get a passport, but it's almost impossible to actually become French.
I mean, it's an interesting question because you've been here for like 30 years. So I feel like my nationality will only ever be American in France. It won't be Franco-American, right? Because my wife, who's not American, likes to remind me how American I am. So
exactly, my point. Exactly.
Yeah. So there's certain things that we will never be able to get out of, but it is a lot. Like, we're going by the books here. So if you are French, you get the French passport. You get the carte nationale d'identité, you have a permanent attachment to France, and you get to be in the good line at the airport, which is the best perk of it all. So I kind of view it like a game, like a square game where you're trying to move the pieces, where you start off without a status and try to build towards having a better status, like Adrian having a 10-year card, eventually filing for naturalization, and then you won the game. And then at that point you stop calling me and you kind of go off and you live your best life here in France. Yes, please.
Could I ask you to just scoot over a little? It's kind of bright light right behind.
Okay.
Well, as long as he's not out of camera.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's good to know.
And the sun moves, and we don't have sun because it's Paris.
That's true too.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, so one of the fun things, whether or not you're looking to make a move here to France, is to talk about the French mentality, because I feel like that's one of the areas I've started to really shine. There is, I kind of call myself a French whisperer, not like a, chouchouteur, like how the French mentality is, how the French Prefecture and the French consular agents, how they're thinking is so foreign to how Americans think that that's one of the first good lessons to learn, is to figure out who are we actually up against, who are we dealing with. And so one of my clients, she gave me her CV to file for an entrepreneur application the other day, and it was so American, in the best and the worst senses, but it started off with kind of like a dreams section, like, I've always dreamt about coming here, like this is like me living here is accomplishing my dreams, and that's so not French, because the French are not here, the administration is not here to talk about like the wishy-washy, the feeling side of things. They're interested in the nuts and the bolts, like the concrete details. That's like the first shift, I would say, in terms of getting into that French mentality, is understanding that we as Americans have a disadvantage and an advantage. The disadvantage is oftentimes the level of French that we have. Like if we're going and dealing with the French authorities, we might not be able to speak regular French or even legal French. But the advantage that we have is the American smile, because I don't want to undervalue that, because smiles are universal. So even if the French say like, oh, I can't believe these French, the Americans are always smiling at me and saying bonjour to me in the street, whatnot. But it's actually like, I think we're actually breaking through to them in a certain sense, because whenever you deal with the prefecture, you're always trying to find that human element. You're trying to make that human connection with them. And that's why I actually don't like when they moved a lot of this filings on the computer, because then you're one step removed. They don't see the human side of things. Whereas sometimes I just say, like, if we can just put your face in front of their face, they'll start to see you as a human and treat you with respect and process your application. Yes, Adrian.
Can I just add something
Please.
to that? Because I learned some tricks a long time ago, which I learned in a Los Angeles post office, where the clerks were like eating the little old ladies alive. But if I would go up to them and say, "Ooh, girl, where'd you get your nails done?" That's all I had to do. So when I got to the Prefecture,
Yes?
literally, if I said, "Oh, your eyeglasses are so cool," anything that would kind of break the ice and create a relationship, and then everything was smooth sailing. Once I did that, it was okay.
Yeah. It also has but like having the level of French to be able to tell them too that you like their eyeglasses. That's also
Even in
that's the
English.
ticket to ride, basically. Even in English
doesn't matter.
I do agree that one of my goals whenever I do an accompaniment to the prefecture is to try to get them to laugh at something, so that we kind of can break that ice and start to be on the same page. When I did my naturalization appointment with the prefecture agents, I was for whatever reason nervous, even though my gig is preparing people for naturalization and kind of training them on it. And we started talking about the symbols of France, and I mentioned, Marianne, who is, the statue you see in a lot of French town halls, and she's wearing the Phrygian cap, which is like the bonnet that's kind of curved over. And then that week was the week that, for the Paris Olympics, they just decided to have that be the symbol of the Jeux Olympiques, which is like, they called it a frige, and so it was this red little floppy thing. And so I started making fun of that with the agent, and I felt like that was the point when he decided that I was French, was that I could mock the official mascot of France. So we kind of both chuckled over how silly the mascot looked for the Olympic Games. Because then it's about, once you've established that connection, then they're more willing to see you as an insider. So that's kind of what I see. People usually come to me after 4 months of butting heads with the administration, and it's like an insider versus an outsider thing. And when I go to the prefecture, they see me as an insider, and then by extension, it's like a friend who's smiling there and just not speaking. And then that's how we can kind of break through the ice with the French authorities and make a real connection. The other side of things that Americans need to learn when they make the move here to France is there is what I would call an American in America mentality versus an American in France mentality. So in the America in America mentality, you live your best life, and then the rules will be fitting into your life, but you take the predominance. But we are here now in a totally different setup, with a different system, and there's a whole set of rules. And then they fit their lives into those rules. And I feel like that's the biggest mental shift that we have to go through when we're making the move here to France, to realize that we're no longer the insiders here. Like, we don't have right to work just, n'importe comment. We can't just do what we want to do, or even stay here if we're talking about renewing the next status and then we're waiting for them to get back to us. We're playing their game because we decided to, because we thought to ourselves that France is cool enough that we need to be here. Therefore, we're going to make the jump here, but then we're also going to have to play their game while we're here. So that's one of the ways that I try to figure out how to navigate the French. I also call my approach to them the silver platter approach. So a lot of Americans will do this where they'll file the renewal of their visitor status and they'll share their American bank statement because that worked when they did their initial application with the French consulate abroad. Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah. We can also close it too. I think we're chilled down enough here. Voilà. Can you please take care of that? So the silver platter approach. If we're dealing with the French authorities, the thing to keep in mind about them was that they were taught English in French school, and in French school they're taught that it has to be perfect English, otherwise you shouldn't speak at all. And so that's a huge difference from how you learn to speak French or Spanish or whatever in America, which is to say, try and try again, just kind of get out there, throw your words together, and see what sticks. And so then there's this conflict when, like, let's say you're filing a renewal and you throw in a US bank statement, because that worked when you filed at the consulate. That puts them on the defense, because now they're seeing a document that's coming at them in English, in dollars, in a weird formatting of how a US bank statement might look, and you're asking them to approve of your application. And they're thinking, no, 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 like, they've set up their alarm, so they're more likely to say no to you. Versus if you show them a French bank statement that's in French, that's in euros, that's formatted in a French bank statement way, then all of a sudden they're going to be like, okay, I could say yes to this. Because maybe Adrian can agree with me. I think of France as the country of no, no, yes. And you always have to push past those no's to get to that yes.
It's always no first.
Yeah, and so
that's the opening to the conversation.
Yeah, it's the entrée. So then if you file for an entrepreneur visa, they're going to be like, no, you can't work in this country. And so then you say, oh, but here's the thing, because I have a CV, and I've got X numbers of years experience, and I've already incorporated in the US, and I've got an LLC, and I've got this master's degree, and I already have these 2 contacts here in France, and they can't wait to work with me. That's a way of kind of getting them to that yes, that they can finally then agree to you for your different application. So when it comes to handling the French authorities, part of it is mastering their mentality, part of them is giving it to them on the silver platter. And that's a lot of the different ways that I try to tackle it. While we're going on, if anybody has any questions or reactions, or if anyone wants to flag a question, I'm sure that your question will be pertinent to other people too, because a lot of it has to do with navigating the system.
These people you don't have questions?
Yeah, please.
What are the pros and cons to having a French bank account, and then what are the consequences back home?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So having a French bank account, pros and cons. If we're talking about, let's take, for example, the bank BNP Paribas, which lets you, it's the one bank that lets you open an account before you get here. And so I sometimes send my clients to BNP Paribas to have that account before you get here. It can sometimes help your life. David, you didn't like BNP?
No, Sherry just asked if that's where we bank.
Okay.
I said, no, that's not where Adrian took us, so we didn't go there.
Yeah.
We went
No.
where Adrian told us to go.
Where do you tell them
That's
to go?
right.
And that's it didn't work.
Yeah. Where do you send them, Adrian?
Well, we have a relationship with CIC here,
Okay.
and in Nice we have a relationship with Crédit Agricole.
Okay.
Because the banks do not open accounts for Americans unless they are introduced, and only certain banks are willing to talk to us anymore, thanks to FATCA.
Yeah. So there's 2 major things to keep in mind when it comes to banking here in France. There's FATCA and there's FBAR. FATCA is what the bank has to do. They have to comply with US banking regulations, which they don't want to do, which is why they don't love us as Americans coming here to France and being their client, because now they have to comply with the different countries' banking regulations. So there's the app that's called Lydia that a lot of the youth are on to give each other like money transfers of $20, 20 euros here or there. They kicked all the Americans off the app because they said, we don't want to deal with FATCA anymore. You guys are all on your own. So there's the FATCA side of things, and there's FBAR side of things, which is just to say, and I'm not the tax or financial guy, but just to kind of give the big picture, that if you have an account abroad that has more than $10,000, you're supposed to report it to the US government. And as our friend Jonathan Hadida, who's a Franco-American tax expert, says, what you do is then you fill in the form. I think it's like 3938. So you declare you've got a foreign account. You don't even have to state how much is in it, and you're good. So on the FBAR side of things,
You do have to state how much has been the most that's been in it at any time during the year.
great, thank you,
Okay.
wonderful. Yeah,
10,000 per year or 10,000, no more than 10,000 per month?
I think if it
No.
goes over 10,000, it has to be declared to the government.
And that's an accumulation of all of your accounts.
Right,
What do you
so
mean all of your-
However many accounts you have outside of the US, it's a total. If they total 10,000 or more, then you have to report it. But there's no tax paid on it. It's just a reporting process.
Right,
It's
which-
not a big deal.
which is why I'm not afraid of it, and which is why I've got
Right,
a whole host of
not a
clients
big
who
deal.
are have multiple accounts that are more than 10,000. So I would say the answer to the question is that's more of a frustration to get the account, but it's good to have it to make your life easier once you're here in France.
Well, you can't pretty much exist here for very long without one.
Yeah.
I mean, if you rent, you own property, anything like that, you pretty much have to have an account. If you're renting an apartment au noir under the table from another American and you're paying them in the US, then you can extract money from using a debit card from any ATM. So you can actually get away with not having an account, but if you're here for any length of time, you really need it.
Just
Yeah.
to apply for a carte de séjour, you have to be required to have a French bank account.
It depends.
No.
Yes, you are. I can tell you from, I was,
Tell us your story. So you're saying that they required you to have a French bank account to
Yes.
file the renewal?
yes.
To file for the initial visa or to file a renewal here in France?
No, and then I didn't have one when I came.
Mhm.
I got my carte de séjour here.
Mhm.
And afterwards, once I got it, because I knew somebody, I was lucky. I then every year I had to do it the first year.
I spoke with an agent on that question a couple years ago, back when the visitor renewals were still in person. And they said, okay, well, maybe for that first year, maybe they're still getting adapted, so they have an open account. But if they don't have an account by their second year, that means they're not residing here. Because the French do this thing where they apply the French the French mentality, and they project it onto other countries. And they assume that everyone else is going to be doing what they're doing here in France. And so they couldn't possibly imagine a person living here in France and not having a French bank account, which is why ultimately, as you said, it's advisable to have one.
Well, let me add something to that, which is, you always need to provide at some point proof that you are domiciled in France.
Mm-hmm.
And generally that happens through your utility bills.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it can happen as well through a bank statement. But there's something that shows you're receiving, you have an account with a utility or something that corresponds with an address directly where you live in France. And so if you don't have a bank account, you can't pay a gas bill, an electricity bill, a telephone bill, or anything like that because of this sort of catch-22 situation. So at some point, I don't know, maybe they've changed the rules since the last time I went to the Prefecture, but you usually have to provide at some point one of those attestations, or what a bill as a proof that you are domiciled in France.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it could also be varying agent by agent because they have, I call them the empereurs du guichet. Like each one is in their own empire, and when you're sitting across from them, they have decided there's a new rule, and you just have to abide by that rule at this moment for this filing. And so it sounds like maybe that agent came at you with saying, okay, we need to have a French bank account. Because we've got a client that's down in Nice who's been just using American bank account and filing online on this website and it's worked for years, and she hasn't had that issue. So if it's a zone grise, if it's kind of a gray area, it could very well be that they don't ask
She
for it.
was just out to get you, Nancy.
Another one.
Yeah, Marco?
In order to get my French health card, I had to give a RIB.
A RIB.
To give my French bank documents.
Yeah, so like Adrian could speak to the extent to which it's so hard for an American to get housing here in France. But part of that is the mentality of France, for a level of country, is not necessarily a country of innovation. I wouldn't use the word innovative to describe of France. And so if we are an American trying to find housing here in France, the first thing they're going to want to see is like a visa, because how can you even rent my place if you can't stay here for more than 90 days? And then they also don't necessarily know the different rules and intricacies of French immigration law and so forth. But then they oftentimes say, okay, well the rent's 1,000, so we want to see 3,000 earnings in France because we want to be able to seize your assets if come at you or have a guarantor. And if you just moved here, if you don't have a father or mother that's your guarantor, then you could maybe go out and get that Guarant Me website where they act as professional guarantor. Mm-hmm. But even that's a pretty big innovation for a landlord or landlady in France to accept, that there's going to be some private company that acts as landlord because they've never really seen that much. And so they might still be hesitant to take you even if you've got a professional guarantor that's covering you. And so part of it is pushing past the mentality of the French. Say, look, I've got a visa, I've got the Guarant Me, I make a lot of money in America, I'm good for my money. It's a matter, maybe it's a bit of a numbers game. You just have to go through enough landlords and landladies until you finally get someone to house you.
We know.
Oh yeah, you know much more than I do. But then that all touches back on this question of documentation, because it is like that. I call it the golden triangle of death. You can't get a phone number until you've got the address and a bank account. You can't get the address until you've got a RIB and the phone number. And you can't get the bank account unless you already have an address and a phone number. And so how does one get oneself out of that? Adrian, yeah.
We get them out of it.
Voila, Adrian takes care of
Because
that.
I have hundreds of people living at my address. True.
Yeah.
They've never caught on. They've never figured it out. So.
Yeah. And as your lawyer, I'm not going to say anything further about that.
And you might want to delete this.
Yeah, all the prefecture agents that are watching 2-hour YouTube videos in English, I don't think they're doing that.
Only reside for a short amount of time.
Sure, yeah, it's a halfway house. Yeah, Marco.
I didn't speak loud enough. I said my health card.
Yeah,
So
Right.
The Amélie, the Carte
Carte Vitale, exactly.
They require a French.
Well, because
Yeah.
they're going to put money in your account.
In order to, I said, well, why do you need my French
Right.
bank information? To reimburse reimburse you?
Exactly.
Yeah, and it makes sense because then the landlords will want your RIB.
Phones, please.
The landlords want your RIB as well because that's how they're going to be expect to be paid from you. And then, as you said, it's getting plugged into the system, and that's why the prefecture agent couldn't possibly fathom you having an account here in France without one. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the Revolut online?
I've got so many opinions about that. So there's and
What was she saying?
she was asking about Revolut, which is online banking. So there's a lot of them. There's N26. There's Revolut.
Bunk.
Yeah.
B-U-N-K. Q.
Yeah. There's a lot of them. I don't love them for a couple reasons. It sometimes happens that the international bank account number isn't French. It's German or Belgian. And even though that should theoretically under EU law be conform, the French might not want to accept that, or the prefecture might not think that's a sign of living here in France. Also, it's super.
Last I read about Revolut is that they're now providing French IBAN numbers.
Yeah, I've read that too, that as of June of last year, they started providing French IBAN numbers for Revolut. I'm still skeptical though, because it seems so easy to get them, and France is such a non-innovative country that having a brick and mortar bank is doing it in the French manner. So part of that silver platter approach is doing things in the French manner. The French, the prefecture at least, are linear thinkers, right? So anytime you have a case file that goes like this, their mind is blown. They can't possibly imagine a person going from the entrepreneur status to the visitor status. It does not compute, right? So part of it is kind of anticipating what they would think to look for. And if you have a French bank statement, they can trust it. Because a lot of it when it comes to proof of housing or proof of banking is having a document that they can sink their teeth into and believe it's a real concrete document. So if we show a proof of address, the golden standard is an attestation EDF. You get an EDF contract attestation, you're good. They believe you're there. Because that came from EDF. They don't think you're going to somehow manipulate that on Adobe, although you probably could.
I'm sure you can.
Yeah. Same thing goes with a bank statement. If it's a monthly bank statement or an attestation that came from your banquier, that looks really concrete and they can believe that. And anything less than that is less good.
The only thing is that like an N26 or Revolut or a Bunk is good on a temporary basis just to have a way of getting your phone set up or things like that.
Sure.
And then once you do that, then you go get your French bank account.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I think that's a perfectly good approach. Yeah.
We have EU passports,
Mhm.
not French. I'm trying to figure out how do I travel with my American passport and my other passport? When do I use which?
Yeah.
And does it give me the right to stay in
Oh, yeah.
France indefinitely?
Yeah. So that's a very lucky category, the people that are EU nationals.
Would you repeat the question?
I'd be happy to, yes. So she was asking a question about having dual nationality, US and EU nationality, and how that all works, how the equation works. So the rule of thumb is in America, in America, they want you to enter America with a US passport. That's what America expects you to do. And if you're an American, go ahead and do that. And Europe, there's two lines at the airport. There's the European line, the EU line, and then everybody else line. And they would also expect you to enter the EU in the EU line because you're an EU citizen. They wouldn't expect you to get in the line for all of us non-EU nationals. So it may somewhat look discombobulated to have all the stamps of entry into the US and all the stamps of entry into France. However, that's both. If you're a national of both those countries, they're happy to see that. They're not here to critique you or refuse you entry. If you show up with the EU passport, they're going to let you into the country. And then in terms of EU nationals living here long term, they only have to do one thing, which is go tell the town hall that they exist. So the town hall knows how many people live in their town so they can count the heads for tax purposes. And that also lets you then vote in EU elections and local elections. So it's funny when I get these messages from like a Polish national, like an American who got Irish nationality or Italian nationality from their grandparent. They're like, what do I have to do? Like, nothing. Like, you show up, you fly here, you're good. My wife is a German national, and when she moved to France, she took the train. Voila. That was what she did. She didn't have to do anything else. And she wanted to vote, so then she registered locally with the town hall. So it's actually quite easy if you're an EU national. I kind of have an internal mental ranking of the different statuses. So French is at the top. They can vote in every election. They're the insiders. EU national is just below that. The 10-year card, which is what Adrian's on, is good because it lets you work in France, it lets you travel, it lets you even move abroad, move back. Like after a couple of years, you're still good. And then various multi-year statuses, like for working or for relationships, being a spouse of French or an EU national. And then the one-year statuses like visitor, student, and then being a tourist, and then being undocumented, which some of my clients are, because they came here, they decided to stay here, and then they realized they have to fit some sort of the rules to be able to qualify for health care and to qualify for the bank and so forth.
I know people who have been here 30 years plus without any visa whatsoever.
And I'll get to you in just a second. So the reality is they then contact me. They say, how much trouble am I? And I kind of feel like my role is to be the immigration confessional, where I come and I hear their sins and I say, you are pardoned for having overstayed for 5 years. But the idea is, when an America overstays and it's time for them to leave, there's 3 things that could happen. 1, nothing. They take their passport, they flip through, they stamp it, they hand it right back. How many people can say, how many people have had this experience where the agent at the border did not care to see my visa, they did not flip through diligently, they just took the thing, stamped it, and they throw it right back at me, and then that's the end of the ball game. The second possibility, sorry, go ahead, Alicia. Yeah, the second possibility is that they give you a fine, that it's a 100 to a 400 euro fine. That is possible. I've seen that twice in the course of several years of doing this.
A fine for what?
For overstaying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They tried to do that for one of my Indian clients. She filed for an exchange of status to entrepreneur, and they never processed it. And then a year later, she was here without status. So she went to the airport, and then she called me. She only speaks English, and she said, the lady's shouting at me. I don't know what she's saying. So they put the phone on, and the lady says, yeah, we want her to pay a fine. Does she have cash on her? And then there was like this back and forth for 20 minutes. She did not have cash on her. She couldn't.
Wonder who was keeping the cash.
Yeah, and eventually the lady just said, whatever, let her through. And so then she left France. She went back to India. She filed for the right visa. She got it. She came right back here into France. And now she has immigration status again in France. The third possibility is an EU ban. You see that a lot in these Facebook groups, like these various Americans in France, American expats in Paris and suburbs, all these various groups. People love to talk about the possibilities of that. And it is true that even if you overstayed one day, you could theoretically get hit with an EU ban. In reality, I just don't see it happening, at least to my clients. But it could be a possibility, so I never want to neglect that as a possibility. I just think statistically or like chance-wise, the odds are high that if you have overstayed and it's time to go, you leave the country, and they're happy to see you leave.
I wouldn't think they would care. You're leaving.
I mean, they could care, right? Because it's a country of nation. They're a sovereign nation. They have rules about entry and exit. We've overstayed, and then therefore they could, kick us out and give us a fine or whatever on the way out. But in terms of what they actually do, I found that France is the most lax on that front, and that Germany, I wouldn't have my clients fly out of Germany to go back to the States. There's certain countries where they're stricter, and I found that all things equal, France is less strict.
I've never had anyone at the airport ever ask for my carte de résident, ever. They just, U.S. passport, go through, stamp it, and it's over.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
If you're a dual citizen in the EU, but you're here only half a year minus some days, so you have U.S. residency, can you still vote in EU elections?
In EU elections, yeah. So you're allowed to vote with regards to the European Union, but you're not allowed to vote for a French president. So that's the foreign against that. There's a hand over here. Yeah.
How would the new custom rules that will go into place impact what we're talking about?
Oh yeah. Oh, I think it will. I think the game will change. I think it's the wild, wild west right now.
But will they come after you?
I think they very well.
Because everything is going to be online now, right?
I think they very well could. So what is about to happen is that they're changing the rules here in France. That in America, we have what's called ESTA. So my German wife has to get her ESTA clearance before she can fly into America. And in France and all across the EU, they're thinking about doing ETIAS, which is the European equivalent. And they've been delaying and delaying the rollout. It should now be roughly November of 2023. In which case, they now will very concretely know your exits and entries and how many days you've been in France. Because what they do is they stamp it, so that's not digital. They do scan your passport, and that is digital. So they could already crack down on you. They could already know how many days you're in and you're out of France. But between having a Maltese or an Irish or an Italian residency permit and a French one, I think each country is acting within its own sovereignty. So you sometimes have clients that are sneaky that have a German residency permit and a French one. And is that quite allowed? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's actually not, but I think it actually happens. And so then the next step is to say, well, as of November 2023, they will theoretically know if you're overstaying. So they might have stricter rules at that point in time. I expect they would.
What's not clear with ETIAS, at least as I've read it, is what happens if you, say as in my case, I have a 10-year residence card.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I have to enroll in ETIAS or whether it's advisable for
No.
in ETIAS,
Can you film it tomorrow for me, please?
I don't know, for example, if a green card holder going to the United States has to be in ESTA if they spend any time, because there are situations where you can have a permit to be able to be outside the United States for more than a year.
Yeah.
I don't know whether they also have to be under ESTA.
Great question. So I can't speak with intelligence about ESTA, which is the US side, but with ETIAS, I can speak with more intelligence, that if you already have a visa, a residency permit, or EU nationality, you're not concerned. It's for everyone that's an American tourist coming to France. So like my mom, when she comes out to visit me, she'll have to get the ETIAS registration before she comes out here to France. So she'll be concerned, but myself as a residency permit holder, I will not be concerned by ETIAS. Yeah.
Oh. And they built out the software so that actually it's going to be easier to be caught than it is now, even with scanning your passport the way you do.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised that it's going to be easier to get caught, I
Yeah.
think. And to a certain extent, it's their game, right? Like this is their country, it's their rules, they're allowed to have whatever kind of board regulations they want. So I let them, I allow them, that's a fair point.
Well, do you have a choice?
No, I mean, as of November, you won't have a choice, right? One of my good friends he's spent 17 years going in and out of France like this, overstaying. He has a house here, his daughter was born here. I got him regularized, and he forgot to go to the prefecture to renew it, so yeah. So now he's back in that water of coming and going. But the solution is getting a residency permit, getting a visa. The idea being that if you want to be here for more than 90 days in a row, or more than 90 days in a floating 180-day period, you have to have some kind of status. And then, as you said, as of November, if they're cracking down, then that'd be a good time to start getting the first one. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to the or what does one need to do in order to move from renewing every year to getting the 10-year card? And then you mentioned something I was unaware of. I think you said that you can actually work when you have a 10-year card?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, on the 10-year card, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's interesting.
the 10-year card is, after 5 years presence, you're allowed to get the 10-year card, which is great for two reasons. Get the prefecture off your back for 10 years, and it also includes work authorization. So you're allowed to work in any manner whatsoever as an entrepreneur, as an employee. You're allowed to incorporate here in France. So it's certainly advantageous to get it. It's in the framework of a renewal that one gets the 10-year card. So like let's say you're on the visitor status and you have 5 years. Visitor status is one of the most categories qualify for the 10-year card, and it's one of them. So you do that annual renewals for 5 years, and then at the 5th year, you file for the 10-year card. And they want to see all the forms of proof that you qualified for the initial category in question, plus 4 years of tax returns filed in France, plus a level of A2 French, which is advanced beginner, unless you're over the age of 65, at which point they say, you're good, stay.
But that does not apply to citizenship, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. So they. That was a question before, because I believe the rule was as of before August 2020, the rule was even, it gets waived as the age of 60, and then they stop waiving it. So now they make everybody, regardless of the age, have a level of B1 when it's time to file for naturalization. So intermediate level of French. Yeah.
What do you do if you want to stay up to 6 months, but you don't want to count the 90 days? What is the visa for that? Because it's not really that you want to be a resident and
Sure.
stay past 6 months.
So the question was about what do you do if you just want to stay up to 6 months? Let's talk about, maybe I shouldn't talk about taxes, but let's talk about taxes. I think that's kind of a good question to address, like when does one start to trigger tax residency or not? So there is a temporary visa that's called the VLST, Visa de Long Séjour Temporaire. And usually you don't want that one, because that doesn't let you renew it in France. You can't, file for the renewals here. You have to go back to your home country if you want to file for a new one. But that's the category that you can get if you want to spend 180 days in a row and no more in France. Because the general rule is 90 days at a time, 90 days in, 90 days out, and so forth. So you could spend half of your year here in France without having triggered any kind of tax residency, without having any legal residency, just being a tourist. But if you want to spend 91 days in a row in France, what I usually recommend to my clients is to go for that visitor visa, the long stay visitor visa, because it's renewable here in France. It's 1 year, and after 5 years you can get the 10-year card. Not everyone wants to put both their feet in France, firmly planted in France. Some people want to have 1 foot in France, 1 foot out of France, which could very well then be the case that the the VLST, the temporary long stay visa, is a good fit for that. I had a lot of folks that got stuck in France in 2020 when COVID struck, and they were on these VLSTs, and they didn't want to fly because we were all talking about how scary flying was at that time. They didn't want to go back. Their cards were expiring. And so then it was the prefecture under a new light, because then we could see how they wanted to treat people as humans. Because usually their answer of the prefecture, if any of you have an experience with them, I think there are a lot of things, but comprehensive is not one of the words that I would use to describe the prefecture. But it was a point where they finally had to be, because we're dealing with a human being that's stuck in a global pandemic, locked down here in France in spite of themselves. One of my clients was a 91-year-old Holocaust survivor who was just here as a tourist in the south of France. He wasn't about to get on a flight, international flight, during the peak of COVID fears. And so we contacted the local prefecture saying, this is what we got. We've got a human being here. You know, he's on a tourist status. Can he upgrade and get a visitor status? And in his case, it worked. And in other ones, it didn't. So I had two Chinese clients who were on the VLST. And we spent months and months knocking on the door of the prefecture saying, look, the flights back to China are 10,000 euros each way. It's China during COVID times. Like, we can't be sending them back. They can't even, you know, the consulates are closed. Every reason for them to be staying here. And the French weren't always willing to listen, but sometimes they were. So that was really interesting to see that. So sometimes the VLST is good. Otherwise, a long stay visitor visa is good. There's the next question, which is with regards to tax residency. So I say that there's legal residency, and then there's tax residency. Legal residency is having the residency permit or not, having the titre de séjour or the visa. This is mine. Or not. And then tax residency is a question of how much you're spending your time in France. So the general rule, and I'm sure Jonathan did a good job talking about this last time, Jonathan Dita, who's the speaker from March, that it's generally within the calendar year, it's 183 days. So if you're spending more than half your year here in France, then it starts to trigger tax residency. Like in America, we file taxes in April of a given year for the preceding calendar year. There's a couple other ways to trigger it. Like if you've moved here with a permanent intent to be here, then you start filing taxes as soon as you get here. So if you're spending less than half the year here, that means that your primary residency is elsewhere. That means that you're filing taxes.
Not necessarily.
Right.
Some people don't live anywhere 183 days.
So then it becomes a little bit of a balancing act to say,
it's where you consider yourself at home, like where your base is.
Right.
And so it can be rather.
It can be, a little bit flu, a little bit subjective.
It can be subjective, yeah.
Yeah. So I do have those kinds of cases where people are saying, 3 months in Dubai, 3 months in the US. And so then you have to say, okay, what is your primary residency? And then I would assume that would actually be in their benefit because they could theoretically then shop around. But the idea is oftentimes people are spending time between one country or the other. So then the matter is then, are you willing to become a tax resident in order to start qualifying for the 10-year card, being able to integrate here long-term, being here, both your feet in France, and that's a personal choice. And that also sometimes has to do with the financial situation of the applicant. Like some of my clients are too wealthy to want to move to France long-term. They have really good resources on the US side, what's a US salary, whatnot, and they're just not ready to accept French taxes on their income. And in that case, then it's a bit of a choice. Do I have 1 foot in, 1 foot out so that I can avoid tax residency, or do I go full force like myself and decide, okay, well, look, I'm an American who loves France. I want to be here all day long, and therefore I'm going to be full force here in France and pay all my taxes in France. Yeah, Adrian.
I just want to clarify one thing. Okay, so basically, okay, if you have a carte de résident, for example, okay, or you want to get your carte de résident, and you have to show that you have had French tax returns, that doesn't mean that you have been tax resident in France necessarily. It just means that you've reported your earnings in France.
But if you're filing your taxes in France, wouldn't that make you a tax resident? Is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying, okay, that maybe you didn't actually spend. You're living here half a year, but your tax residency is still the U.S.
Okay.
But you want to get your carte de résident after 5 years, and you can't do that without showing French tax returns.
Yeah.
So you do French tax returns, but you don't owe any tax to France because you're tax resident in the U.S.
Right.
So it's, and I know people who are doing this. Okay.
And if you want better tax advice, you can talk to Adrian. No, you can. So on Adrian's website, I'm on there. My face is big on there. There's also Jonathan Adita, and she's got referrals for good Franco-American tax people. Yeah.
I wanted to mention about the 183-day rule. We moved here in August 30th of 2021, so we spent 4 months and a day in France and confidently didn't report our revenue in 2022 and promptly received a notice of non-filing, non-reporting. And then I went to various sources of information and received conflicting information. But we had sold our U.S. Property, our home, before moving here, and so
the smart thing to do.
The winning argument came down on the side of, on the day you got off the plane, you had no residency other than France. This was your domicile on the day you arrived. And had you arrived on January 31st, technically you still would have had to report your 2021 revenue in 2022. I still have conflicting opinions from various people as to whether that's true, but it turned out to be very easy to report our revenue.
Okay.
No one has talked about fining us for not reporting it, and I would fight that if they did. But that was the, I can't make an argument that as of September 1st, I had any other residency for the rest of that year. I was relying on the 183 days rule. But again, I was thinking as an American and not a French tax officer.
Yeah. So the question, just to repeat it for the camera and such, was that about date of arrival of August 1st. What does that imply then for that calendar year? And I like the 183-day rule, but I think it's a bit of a shorthand to kind of help us big picture understand it. Benjamin Peake, who is also the other major, Franco-American
He's on
tax
our site too.
Voilà, he's also on the site. He's also my company's own tax accountant. He and I had a phone call about this the other day, about this question of arriving on August 1st, because I had been saying up to now, like, well, there's this 183-day rule, there's the question of permanent residency, and he was saying that he advised people to start filing if they move on August 1st here to France, because if they intend upon being here in France and then going forward, then even then theoretically they should have established their tax residency when they got here. I was speaking with Nicole in the back before the thing started, and when she first moved here, she was saying that she wasn't yet certain if she was going to be here in France or if she had residency elsewhere. So it could certainly be iffy. Like, the French tax authorities don't always know you exist until you tell them that you exist, until you make that first filing. I'm not sure how they found you, but
me either.
Renewing the CDS, probably.
I don't think so, because the way that
paying garbage collection taxes.
it could be. The thing about the French government is that I consider it to be very siloed. So there's the Prefecture, who's not talking with border control, who's not talking with the Fisc, the tax authorities, who's not talking with URSSAF, French Social Security. I don't think they're talking with each other. And I think they could be, and I think maybe 10 years ago they might have thought about that, but then there came this thing called GDPR, which is protecting your own personal data. So the Prefecture cannot be sharing your documents with the tax authorities just like willy-nilly, because you haven't given them your permission to do so. And that's also what I call extra homework, and I have yet to see the Prefecture do extra homework. So they're not, in my opinion, going around, snooping around, asking other departments for other documents. If we're talking about the 10-year card, you do have to show your tax returns. That's the first time usually that my visitors show their tax returns to the French Prefecture. And so then that's where theoretically things could be coming to the surface. Like, okay, now the immigration authority is aware of my tax situation. But up until then, for the first 5 years, they don't see your tax returns.
They don't have any clue that you're even here.
The tax people.
Right, no.
Right.
Normally, they don't have a clue that you're here.
Although if a person is living here mostly, I do recommend to file taxes in France. Yeah?
I had an earlier question about the long-stay visitor visa and how they ask you to validate online for 3 months.
Yeah.
But if you have it for a year and you're not 100% sure you're staying, do you still need to do it or do you not? What do you think?
So about the question about visa validation of the long-stay visitor visa, the rule of thumb had been that you arrive on the date of arrival, and within 3 months of arrival, you file online for the validation of the visa. They still say that, and frankly, if you wait 8 months and then do it, it's still done, quote unquote, correctly. It generates the same document with a foreigner number that you can then use for further exchanges with the Prefecture. So there's no real...
Just do it within the year.
Yeah, I mean, my advice is to do it within the first 3 months, because that's what they officially ask us to do. But if you don't do that, if you manage to break past that, then as your immigration confessioner, I forgive you. It'll still be fine. They'll still process the application because you'll have a foreigner number. And it's not too much of a downside to register, because all it is paying a €200 fine, so there's that. And then they give you a medical convocation for OFII, O-F-I-I, the French Office of Integration and Immigration. And their role is to onboard immigrants. So one of my housemates is an Iranian refugee, and so he had to do a lot of OFII trainings to figure out how French unemployment and housing and all that works. OFII also is there to help make sure that foreigners getting off the boat aren't, sick, which I feel like it feels like it's a throwback to World War II, because they're checking for tuberculosis. They want to make sure you don't have tuberculosis, as if that was a serious plague. All these foreigners flying in from LaGuardia have tuberculosis. That we need to stave that off. And then they don't require that for the talent passport applications, which is those multi-year, highly skilled visas. So is it that the highly skilled don't have tuberculosis, but the people on the visitor status do have tuberculosis, we have to test all of them to control them. So there's not too many downsides to doing it. Whenever you want to leave France, whenever you're done with France, you just go. And you let your status expire, and then it ends, and that's the end of the day. For my clients that came from Germany, they always have to tell the German equivalent of the prefecture every time they're leaving, they have to change their address. The French don't have enough organization to follow you for where you are. So you might be moving around different addresses they might not know, but when it's time to go, if you have 3 months left on the status, you just let it expire, you don't renew it, and you leave. So the ball's in your court to file the renewal. It can only give you more options. And even if you do it late, it'll still be okay. Yeah?
I wonder what's involved in the renewal of the 10-year card at the end of the first 10 years.
They try, Adrian can speak to this directly, they try to make it as...
But it's been 9 years since I've done it.
They try to make it as easy as possible. So like the checklist looks incredibly simple. It shows, show me your proof of address, show me your passport and your photos, show me your last 10-year card and some kind of, your last tax return. And then they're happy to renew it. So it should be easy. One of my clients lives in Argenteuil, which is in the 95, which is my second least favorite prefecture. Nice is my least favorite prefecture, for what it's worth.
Sorry.
Yeah. But you're filing here in Paris. Yeah, there we go. And he should have had a clockwork 10-year card renewal because he's been here for so long, and it's been dragging on for months and months and months. And that's not a him problem, that's a prefecture problem. Prefecture of Argenteuil is not good. They're not reactive. They don't reply to emails. They don't process things on time. And so what I usually advise people is to move where you're going to move, and then we'll fit the prefecture into your life, except for Argenteuil. Don't move to Argenteuil. Live elsewhere in France. Yeah.
And I have a follow-up comment about that. When I went to apply for it, get my 10-year card, I was thinking, well, what if 10 years from now I'll be in my 80s? 10 years after that I'll be in my 90s. What's it like to fill out all the paperwork and come in? And while I was standing there waiting in the line, a lady came in a motorized wheelchair, propelling herself in her little wheelchair, and a gentleman was brought in by some young lady, and he had a hospital wristband on him. So people come out of APOD and nursing homes or homes and elderly, and they're given their renewal. Well, stay in France.
Yeah. It's interesting because the French, much more than Americans, don't believe in special treatment or expedited processing, which I would say is actually in their favor. Because in America, you can get things done quicker if you pay for it. Like a passport renewal, you can get it done real quick if you're willing to pay for it. And France believes enough in égalité, they're not going to have some kind of expedited processing for certain people. And so then that means that...
No global entry.
They would come to the front of the line, and somebody announced, okay, priority, and they just came right in up to the very
And that's like the handicap policy of this country, to let the people go first. But one of my colleagues saw Bradley Cooper renewing his visa at the prefecture. When Kanye West filed for his visa, he had to go appear in person. So they still do theoretically have similar processing. And even my clients that are stuck in the hospital, they do require them to get out of the hospital to go collect the residency permit. You cannot send your lawyer to go do it for you, because that's rule for everybody, and we're not going to make exceptions. But when he came out of the hospital, he's walking with a cane, we could go to the front of the line, and then we're in and out in 8 minutes because he was the first person in line.
You can't get your letter at the post office if you're not there in person. Are you kidding? It's the same story.
Yeah, it's the same linear mentality about proving your identity, and if we're not going to believe you that you're the one, they don't give you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, back there.
So I've been in the middle of doing the online application to renew my 1-year visa.
Yeah.
And it's a long, complicated story. I won't tell you except for that it's up in a couple of weeks. I have moved a couple of weeks ago. Now I'm not sure where to do things to get my car all finished and to get my visa done.
Yeah.
Should I stay with the 14th where I was living, finish my paperwork, and then tell them I moved? Should I tell them I moved now and now I'm in?
Did you go from Paris to outside of Paris?
No, I've always been in Paris.
Okay, so from the immigration standpoint, that's good news that you'll still be under the jurisdiction of the Paris prefecture. So the idea of moving around is a real complicated issue for foreigners. It's most poignant when you're filing for naturalization and you're like 1 or 2 years in, and then you move to a different prefecture, a different département. That's when the prefectures are usually like the nastiest, where they're going to say, okay, here's your case file back, please refile there and start all over again. So my general policy is to not signal too much moves to the prefecture, especially with this new online platform, ANEF. That's like the new platform for foreigners. It's where you do the visitor visa renewals and such. There's a link on there to click Déclarer un changement de situation, to say I've moved. And then there's so many bugs with that thing, where the website thinks you've moved and you should have a card that's ready for you, and the prefecture did not make you a card. And so then it's time to file a renewal, but you're blocked because the website won't let you file because they can let you file if you don't have a card. But the prefecture didn't make you a card. So everyone's pointing fingers and no one's willing to listen. What I generally tell my people to do when it comes to change of address for prefecture stuff is save it for the next filing and then have the new proof of address when you're filing the renewal or the change of status. And then that's, generally speaking, the best way to approach it. I don't have an expertise with regards to CPAM for French public healthcare filings. It's a hassle either way. Yeah. Yeah.
Adrian mentioned in her most recent newsletter that there's a new legislation for a different kind of visa. Going back to my 6-month requirement, it would be a 5-year visa for 6 months at a time.
Adrian, do you know what you're talking about?
People who have second homes.
No.
I think, did
No,
you email me about that 2 weeks ago?
No.
Okay, I got an email about that very specific line, and I have not yet heard of a second home visa. So
It was designed for the English people after
Oh, it's for the
Brexit.
yes. It's for Brexit.
well, I mean,
It's a special visa for. It was
But it's not
designed
an-
for the British, except that it's for everyone because they can't make it specific to the British.
okay,
For
so
people who own a second
Do we have
home.
the timing of when it might be decided or rejected?
so to my knowledge, that's not in the new immigration bill. That's before the French Assemblée nationale, because there's
It's
a certain.
it's a proposal that's out there. is
Okay,
what
I'll
it
have to take a
is.
look at that proposal because I've taken a
Yeah.
look at the bill for they
Right.
do basically a new bill every year for French immigration, and this new one is about regularizing people, pulling them out of the shadows. I think this is actually a win-win. This one, where they're saying there's certain industries that we can't find enough people in, regardless, foreigner, European, whatever, and that's construction, it's healthcare, and so we're going to create new residency people to pull people out of the shadows to fill those gaps that we just can't fill. So that's one of those new categories that they're talking about. For secondary homes, because I had a client ask me about that 2 weeks ago, so I did a deep reflection on it, and I Googled it, I didn't see anything. They don't love people that have secondary homes here. Like, they don't want to give people with secondary homes privileged status. Because the French love people that's going to invest in France. This is why there's no golden visa for France, right? Like, you have all these Mediterranean countries, Malta, Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, that have these golden visas say, look, if you pay 500,000 euros, we'll be happy to have you and your money. The French have such a high opinion of themselves, they're not willing to be bought in a certain sense. They don't want to give you any kind of, cushy
Well,
golden
they don't
visa.
want to be less French either.
Right, they've got, right.
I
so
mean,
they've got
by
a,
including immigrants, forget it.
Right, so they've got such a good, well-functioning economy. They're not going to bend over backwards to get people with money to come in and bring the resources into this country. So the idea that there's a 5-year status for secondary homes, that sounds super advantageous, right, for a person that has 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the door. When Brexit occurred, they basically did that. There was 5-year cards and 10-year cards for British nationals that established residency before 2021, before Brexit occurred. I've yet to hear about them extending it, but I'll take a look into that after.
Yeah, this is about ownership, people who own a secondary residence here.
Because what those folks usually do is that VLST status, where they come out on a temporary status. They can come for up to 6 months a year. But I don't know about that 5-year regular. I would love for that to happen, because that would have less people going to the prefecture to get things renewed. But that's an innovative thought, and I don't think the French have thought that thought. Yeah.
You started to touch on this earlier, but so I have dual residence or dual citizenship with Ireland and the United States.
Wonderful.
My wife does not. Can you sort of paint a picture of
I
residency?
can. So there is a status that is my status, spouse of an EU national. It's a good 5-year card. It includes full work authorization, and it's free, which is great. Because if you compare that to the French spouse status, I've got 5 years, they get 1 year. Mine is free, theirs costs 225 euros. And I can get it here locally in France, and they have to go get it from abroad from the French consulate and then arrive in France on it. And that's because the EU directives is a higher law than French sovereign law about how they're going to treat the spouses of people. So then your spouse's goal is to arrive in France within 90 days and contact the local prefecture and request this status. There's 99 prefectures in France, and there's 99 different ways that this is processed. So I did an article about this in my LinkedIn about all the different ways that this has gone wrong, because this should be super theoretically easy, right? Like, it's a very simple checklist. I am the spouse of an EU national. Here's their passport, Irish. Here's our marriage certificate, sworn translation, proof of address together. Like, that could be so easy, right? But because each one is doing it piecemeal, we did the filing back in November. In October, it got approved for one client. Then in November, we did it again for a new client. It got approved and then switched back into draft mode. And then they said, oh, please use that new website, enough, that everything's going on to. But it hadn't yet gone live in enough until March of this year. And so then we were going on back and forth with the prefecture one of my accompaniments was down to Aix-en-Provence. I did a consultation last year with a guy, and I said, look, that's what the category is. You go to the prefecture within 90 days, you get it. And he went, and the lady across the desk said, that category does not exist. Go back to UK, get a visa, and then return back here to France. And so then he hired me. I went down to Aix-en-Provence like a superhero. This is one of my more glorious moments. And we got the same lady that he got 6 months prior. And she said, bah oui, bien sûr, like of course this exists. And then at every point, she was trying to say no to the case file, because we talked about the no, no, yes rule of France. And so they had gotten paxed like 8 months, but had 2 years of living together. And she said, oh, they've only been paxed for 8 months? Oh, c'est pas possible, I can't do this. Like, you have to have 12 months. And I said, well, look at that's not a rule, and look at all this proof of communal life. And then they were like, oh, but he didn't get a visa to enter France, c'est pas possible. And I was like, it's possible. Like, this will all be ready. This will be good. And we walked out of there with the residency permit, with the récépissé, I should say, with the temporary residency permit. So it went through, but with a lot of hassle. One of my clients in Roanne, it took her 8 months to get the prefecture to apply for her request for an appointment. So during those 8 months, she didn't have any status. And it doesn't feel good to not have a status. It's psychological. It plays with your head to not have a status. And during that time, she moved back to America, and then she removed back to France, and we're still waiting for them to get back to our initial request. And then she filed, and then they treated her like a dream. Like, they were replying to her emails within an hour afterwards. They were like cordial to her. They said, well, hold on to your card as soon as you're ready. Come back to France and come get it. Like, it was just getting her face in front of their face, and then it changed the whole game. But it was getting her face in front of their face that took us 8 months to do that. And part of my, this is the part that's on YouTube that shouldn't be on YouTube. Part of what I said to her was like, look, if you can just get a proof of address in Paris, it functions currently in Paris. There's a point before the whole website fiasco where it was functioning quite smoothly. I said, if you can have anybody house you in Paris, you could file in Paris, we can get it in 3 weeks. It's smooth. And she didn't want to, from the ethics standpoint, she didn't want to say that she was living in Paris if she wasn't living in Paris. So we went with filing in Rouen. It took 8 months. So that's a long answer to a short question of what does an EU spouse have to do? Yeah. Yeah.
So we've lived in Paris for about 10 years.
Great.
And have the 10-year card.
Great.
Took us a few years to get there. But now we find ourselves in a situation where my mother-in-law is 96 years old and lives in the United States. And so when COVID struck, we went back to the United States, bought a house. And now we're spending more than half our time in the United States. But we're still filing taxes in Paris, still living at our address in our apartment in Paris. We have feet in both countries.
Yeah.
Obviously, it would save money, accountant fees, if nothing else, to just file taxes in the U.S.
Sure.
But looking forward, we're hoping to renew that 10-year card if we can live long enough. So,
can you open the window again? It's a little bit
what's your advice for somebody in that situation where life has changed and you find yourself actually spending more time in the U.S. now?
So
let's say it's 7 months and 5 months.
Yeah. So for a person that's staying in France for more than, going back to the U.S. for more than maybe one should under the 10-year card, the actual advantage of the 10-year card is it lets you be outside of France, but within the EU for 6 years, and then 3 years outside of the EU.
Oh.
And so it does allow for life circumstances to carry you to Tokyo or Jerusalem or whatever for a couple of years. And then theoretically you come back here to France. And at that 10th year when it's time to file the renewal, as Adrian's about to face, I found they don't care enough about those in-between years, because they're really, France is always about what are you doing lately? So what is your proof of address lately? What is your most recent tax return? And that they're not going so far back to ask you for multiple years of tax returns. And so if you're back in France by the time it's time to file for the renewals for at least a couple years, it should be relatively smooth to file for the 10-year card. I would assume that would go through well.
And if we just, like this year, I haven't filed in France yet. We just didn't file.
Well, when it comes to taxes, weirdly enough, the 10-year card and naturalization, they have different standards. So when you're first filing for the 10-year card, they want to see 4 or 5 years of tax returns. For naturalization, they only ever care to see 3 years of tax returns, which I find peculiar. When it's time to renew the 10-year card, they're not asking for 5 more years of tax returns. That's not on their checklist. They usually ask for the most recent tax return, and then they stop themselves there. So they could investigate your tax history more, but the French government doesn't know much unless you put the documents in front of their face. So when it comes time to file for the first visa or the renewals, they're going to go off of what documents you give them. And if they're not asking for more years, multiple years of tax returns, then you could very well be in a grace period right now where you're allowed to live abroad and then when it's time to file the renewal, you do it here in France. Yeah.
Yeah, I got my 10-year card in 2016, right before a number of things changed, including Après d'Indication, which I didn't have to worry about.
Yeah.
And now everything, or a lot of documents are filed online. So I'm thinking I don't really want, a couple of years' time to go back through all the hassle. I'm fully enough installed here in France that I feel like I want to go ahead and request nationality.
Great.
To start the naturalization process.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a paper chase where you get everything together and then you shove it through the portal online, so that they can start looking at it, or can you, for example, go ahead and do your language test and get that out of the way, or how do you
Yeah.
need to start this sort of process?
So with regards to the question of how do you tackle getting together a naturalization case file, that's the biggest and messiest case file you can have.
You talk to him.
There's most documents you can start to gather beforehand. So when you get married in France, they require your birth certificate to be less than 3 months old. When you naturalize, they don't care how old it is. The reason for that, by the way, about the 3-month rule, is that in France, a birth certificate is a living, breathing document where every time you get married or paxed or divorced or whatever, it gets indicated on the birth certificate. And then the French mentality is then to take that idea and then project it out onto other countries and assume they do the same. Versus in America, you just have your birth certificate. It's over and done. That's the document. And so at least at the prefecture, they're well enough aware that that's the case. So you could start gathering today your birth certificate, get it apostille. Apostille is when the state you're born in looks at it and says, yes, this is from us, and they authenticate it. You can get sworn translations of those. Those don't expire either. You can get your parents' documents. You can get your criminal background check from the FBI. You can get all those documents that are US documents. I already have them ready. And that's the only things you need from the US. Everything else is France-based. And so then it's like taxes. It's proof of your employment in France, because they want to see that you're working here in France. They want to see the B proof of level. And so if you're having to sit for a test, those tests are usually valid for 2 years. Otherwise, if you've got a diploma or a certificate, those are valid. So that's generally the approach. It takes 3 to 4 months to put together a case file.
But for example, for the language test, do you request that through the French government, or do you just go to the accredited test facilities and you say, I want to take a French test? And they'll just go ahead and do it?
I just did it.
Did you pass?
No, I didn't do the test yet. No, but
I saw your
a week and a half. Okay, in a week and a half I'm taking it. No, but Alliance Française is one of the outlets that gives the official test, and I just went online and scheduled an appointment.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk after this, but I mean,
sure.
I'm a retired diplomat who was a consular officer. One of the things I learned in consular training was, with all due respect, a lot of people hired lawyers to do things they could do on their own.
Yeah.
I basically done everything, including filing my taxes and getting my status to where it is now on my own.
Yeah.
So it's just but now that the French have sort of changed the system to, in a way, innovate, it's become a bit more complicated, because quite frankly, it was a pain in the butt to have to print everything up, multiple copies, which they almost never took, so you gave them whatever it was they needed. They went through the file, looking for the mistakes and the errors, and generally not finding anything, and kind of, being desperate because, well, we can't reject anything in your file, so we'll just go ahead and, give you your
approval.
Documentation, give you the approval. But now that, I sort of wonder to what extent that personal aspect, which I used to play on, with all the things that Adrian and others have said, it has gone out the window. And to the extent to which it's a paper chase where I, basically throw the documents over an electronic transom, and then somebody sorts through them, and, I don't know how the feedback comes in terms of telling me, well, this isn't right, that's not right, do I go down to see somebody,
Yeah. So the question being, how much has this changed now that it's online? How much do you have to convince them, personal wise? I always say, with regards to hiring a lawyer or not, that it's a personal choice and it's about autonomy. And if you feel autonomous enough to do it on your own, that's perfectly fine. And if you want someone to handhold you and optimize the case file and know what they're going to be looking for and anticipate that and present it on the silver platter in the French manner, then that's a way of making your life a little bit easier. When I went to Adrian's conference in September and spoke down in Nice, And the question was asked, do you need to hire a lawyer or not? And a lady raised her hand and she said, I spent this whole summer not realizing that France Visa, the website for the form, and the VFS, which is where you have the appointment, is not the same thing. And I thought I had the login from France Visa was going to be good for VFS, so I couldn't book an appointment for 4 months. And I said, I could have told you in 10 seconds how to, and I said, it could have saved you 4 months in terms of making your life easy. So it's sometimes what you don't know what you don't know, like what Donald Rumsfeld said. But there are certain people that I see during the course of the consultation that are so autonomous that they kind of got it. They get the French mentality, which I think you might be one of those people, in which case, feel free to go forward and attack it. The next question is, how, now that it's behind a computer screen, how much less personal is it? And I'm afraid that they have what I call the invisibilization of the suffering. So like last year in Paris, you couldn't get an appointment to save your life to collect the residency permit. It took 2 months to book in the future. And the platform was always just overloaded with tens of thousands of foreigners looking for that slot to collect their residency permit. And so you're there, you're screaming at your computer, and no one's hearing you. And the French people walking in the street don't hear you. And there used to be all those queues, out in front of the prefecture. And they don't want people to be seeing that. They don't want the voters to be seeing that. So they put us all behind our computer screens at home to be screaming at our computer screens. And if, for whatever reason, we do a filing, and then it was just closed online, clôturé, you want to be like, what do you mean closed? Like how, but sir, you want to contest, but you can't because it's a screen, and you don't even know the name of the agent that closed it for you. They have done a really good job insulating themselves behind the screen. I have a Microsoft Word of the 3 pages of screenshots I've taken of error messages on their different websites, because I'm tearing my hair out, because this is all I do. I go to bat and I deal with the bad administration on behalf of my clients. And their website is innovative, and it could eventually become good, but if it has so many bugs, it can be really frustrating. And if you're stuck in one of the situations where your card is blocked, or if the change of address is blocked and you can't go forward, that can be really frustrating too, because it's hard to get their attention. They successfully insulated themselves. And you used to be able to go to the prefecture in person before COVID. And then they closed that down with COVID. They say for hygienic reasons, you can no longer just walk in, you have to get an appointment. So they've erected extra barriers to make it super hard to get their attention, to get in front of them. And that's kind of what we're up against until you become French, and then you're one of them. So, yeah.
I've lived here 8.5 years. I'm just early this year. I've got my 10-year residency card. I've never filed French taxes, and I've not made 1 centime yet.
Okay.
Why would I do that?
You got your carte de résident without showing tax returns?
I don't really have a good answer to that situation because it's on their official checklist. So every prefecture agent has ministerial instructions. They have to go by what their checklist is.
I know what it is. It's
and it includes
Nancy Smile. That's all she had to do, and they just went, we like you, we're going to let you in because...
Right. Yeah. So that might be like the discussion of that one agent that you had that gave you a 10-year card without having tax residency. No, there was a person sitting in front of you that gave you that filing, that told you you're all good. Because what happens is then that agent sees you, they oftentimes sit down with you, and then they tell you to go sit for 40 minutes. And then they take the case file and they give it to their manager, and the manager does another look through of it. And so there has to be approved by 2 people before they approve any given application.
Well, let me
Please.
just finish the story.
Yeah, I'd love to.
The 10-year residency card. I had just had an operation, and I was a little wobbly, so my friend accompanied me, and I was hooked, our arms were hooked or whatever. There was not 1 person in line at the prefecture, not one, but there are 2 young women. I showed them my complication, blah, blah, blah. There was another woman with a clipboard, a Frenchman, who came over and said, I will take you in. Okay. Took us in, through security, everything, went in. She took my documents, went up to the window, did something, came back and said, like, you go to that window over there. I sat down, I signed something, showed them my passport, I got it, my residency card. Now, you talk about luck. I mean, I don't know how that happened, because I hear all these stories, and I know what I went through just renewing my 1-year residency card. It was such a hassle every time. And yet, this one just should, So now, do I don't want to file a French tax return. I make no money here in heaven, and I feel like they're going to find me or something.
I mean, so the 10-year card I call it a 10-year card to not have confusion because, Adrian calls it the carte de résident, which is a technical name. But I find it confusing between titre de séjour, carte de séjour, carte de résident. It all sounds like the same thing, and it's not the same thing. There's the 10-year card, and then there's any other given, card,
Right.
status. And résident for me involves that earlier metaphor I had about the legal residency and the tax residency. They want to have all residencies here. They want you to be a tax resident in order to qualify for it. So I'm not sure that they're going to come knocking on your door because they're not knocking on your door for 10 years' time, right? If you have a 10-year card. But when it's time to file the renewal, I couldn't guarantee that they're going to be stoked about the case file because they might find things they need to. Perfect.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you about this very thing because my daughter's renewal of her carte de résident is up in a couple of years.
Yeah.
But she's certainly not here 6 months a year and has never earned money here and never turned in a tax return.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what we're going to do.
Yeah, it depends on the filing. If it moves online, then it'll be very explicit at that point in time. Because as I said about the spouse of an EU national, there's 99 ways to process it. For the carte de résident, it's also 99 different ways for 99 different prefectures. And we were looking yesterday on a client who was in a consultation to file for the 10-year card, and the website on the prefecture didn't even state how to do so. So then it's a matter of contacting the prefecture to ask them, how does this even work to get this category? So once it gets streamlined and put onto that ANEF website, then it'll be explicitly clear whether or not they're going to be requiring the proof of your most recent tax return or not to get it approved. And that might have an impact on whether or not you get it or not.
But I don't have to worry about that for 10 years, right?
Right, for 10 years you're covered, you're set. Yeah.
I'm wondering how residency works with with estate taxes. Because you mentioned at one point, if you don't want to be a resident anymore, you just walk out and you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you get to the point where you have a 10-year card, and then you're like, I don't want my estate to be taxed in France. How does that work?
Yeah. So with regards to questions,
and how do they even know? I mean, how do they know you have an American estate?
Yeah. So with regards to estate, what I generally just refer to a colleague who's a Franco-American wills and estates lawyer. From what I've understood, when you pass, it is your last place of residence that then determines in terms of inheritance laws and so forth. And the trick is to have a U.S. will, have it be certified on the U.S., get a U.S. will, and then have it be notarized here in France by a French notaire. And then that says, in the event of my passing here in France, it is this U.S. will and U.S. law that is binding. And then in that event, then it's the U.S. will that takes precedent.
But that doesn't change the taxation. You
Right.
can bequeath how you let. You can base the way you bequeath on U.S. law, but that doesn't change the taxation in France.
If we're talking about a French property?
And if you're tax resident in France, then your heirs are going to be taxed on your worldwide holdings from the French point of view.
But I guess so that's daunting.
Yes, it is.
But let's say you're not feeling well, and you just return to the States and say, hey, I'm not a French resident anymore.
I think that's a little bit more into...
but it's tax residency. Again,
right.
It has to do with tax residency.
I kind of want to defer on those questions to a wills and
Jonathan.
estates a specialist on that, because it's a little bit too nitty-gritty.
Talk to Jonathan Hadida. He's also on our site.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
and
He doesn't do.
he doesn't do inheritance.
Right. But I've got a referral for you. So Pierre
Okay.
Taponier is the
Okay.
guy that I refer people to on that matter.
Johnny Holiday thing.
Yeah.
Related to this, what triggers wealth tax?
So let's talk about wealth tax. The questions about wealth tax.
Are you sure you want to talk about tax at all?
I've got a good enough understanding, and I also gave those
okay.
caveats when I decided that I'm not competent enough to answer the question fully. So Macron did away with the wealth tax and he put into what I would call a real estate tax. So the way that one effectively works is that it's two ways of working. If you are owning property in France but not living in France, or if you are living in France and own property worldwide. So if you are, let's take the first example. You're an American, you don't have a residency status in France, you're coming and going, but you own a property that's here in France. If that property here in France is above 1.3 million euros, then that's when the wealth tax can start to kick in on property. And it starts at 0.75%. So 0.5% of 1.3 million is 10,000 euros annually. So, all things equal, if you have a 1.3 million house and you're getting taxed 10,000, that's decent. If you have made the move here to France as an American, you're living here now, and you've got a nice mansion in LA and you bought another property here in France, then we're starting to talk about a worldwide wealth tax. And so then that is 1.3 million euros or more on your worldwide assets. And then, of course, there is the rule about 5 years grace period for the first 5 years. So one of my friends who was well established and wealthy came here, was up here for up to 5 years and then left. And he did not want to trigger any kind of wealth taxes. So that was his approach. So that's my answer, Adrian, on wealth tax. I don't claim to go further than that.
Well, you know the trick. The trick is to sell the U.S. property on which you pay very expensive property taxes, so that you can then just pay the wealth tax here and it'll be less.
Sure, that's fine. And then one of the things that our colleague Jonathan Anita always says is, if you're making the move to France to sell, and you're looking to sell your U.S. property, to sell the property in the U.S. on the U.S. side before you make the move here to France, before you trigger tax residency here in France.
Right.
Because if you are living here in France, a tax resident, and you sell, then it's going to be subject to all kinds of French taxes, and that's where it looks kind of nasty.
It didn't work for Dean though when he sold his house first.
No, but it's not revenue that I reported.
Right. It worked on that issue.
Okay.
Right.
That transaction was
It also depends on how honest you are, too. Unfortunately, American tax authorities don't talk to each other about all this stuff.
Not yet.
Right. That involves homework. So yeah. You had a question?
Kind of along the same lines, because I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
So if I'm wanting to keep my property in the U.S., I'm not going to sell, and want to purchase a piece here, how does that affect my residency and the taxes if I'm going to be back and forth?
So then I would start to defer. You're shaking your head. No, Adrian.
Oh, it doesn't affect anything here.
Will it help my residency?
No.
No.
And can I rent that piece out when I'm not
On the French side or on the U.S. side?
on the French side?
So on the French side, that's where I give my one word of caution for the people on the visitor status, that you are promising to not have a professional activity in France, which is say not having a French employer, not having a French client. And if you're on this visitor status and you own property here in France, and you're fructifying that property, and you're making it productive, and you're contacting the clients, and you're hiring the maid, that starts to look like work. And if you promise to not be working in France, my word of caution on a visitor status is to not do that for those first 5 years. To wait till you get the 10-year card, which you're allowed to work in France, and then go to town with your Airbnb.
So would it be okay if I continue to work in the States, keep my land in the States, have a piece here, and then not rent it out and just let it be empty?
On the French side, you're considering keeping the property empty?
Well, I was afraid to rent it out. No.
Yeah, well, so my recommendation is to live in it, or have it be a place where your friends are staying. But if you're getting financial revenue from that French property, that's where I'd be raising my flag and saying, well, as the immigration lawyer, I can't sign off on the.
Yeah, but you can report it and pay the tax on the rentals.
But the problem is, if you're on a visitor status, you're not allowed to be working here in France and having your French clients. So if the work is being done here in France, that's where they could have issues. The prefecture might not know about it until you're starting to file for the 10-year card and they're seeing all your tax returns.
Never seen that happen.
And the definition of work
Never
here
seen it
is
happen.
so broad that even getting, an honorarium for a lecture is something, if you're on visitor status, don't do it. Because if somebody's reporting, if you've received income or what have you to the French authorities and you're not, supposed to be doing that because of your status, that can cause problems.
So what I have seen, I don't want to address the specific question of teleworking here on the visitor status while I'm getting filmed. I prefer for that to be an in-person consultation. But if we're talking about working, one of my clients contacted me, or a person contacted me. She was on the visitor and he was an entrepreneur. And in his entrepreneur, he stated that she was helping him run his company here in France. And that's what she got, what they call an OQTF, an obligation de quitter le territoire français, deportation order. Because he was honest enough to say that she was working here in France for his French company. And then that's what was the trigger then for them to not be happy. Because it's what you were saying, to what extent could they be aware of what you're doing outside of France or inside of France? What they can be aware of is what's being declared here in France. So what I can be absolutely clear on is not having a French gig while you're here on the visitor status. Yeah?
What if the person who has a place here and was thinking about renting it out while living in the States, what if she rented to Americans and charged American US dollars and got paid in dollars and no transaction here was done in Europe?
Just don't tell anybody, okay? Like your lawyer or your accountant.
So there might be So Nancy, there might be the Adrian answer and the Daniel answer, right? which is, of course, what Adrian likes to say is the advantage of being the tag team here is that she can tell you what you need to hear and I can tell you what you have to hear. So that could be considered travail dissimulé, if work is being done but hidden. To say like, oh, okay, well, I did have a French property, but I was getting paid out of America. That then means that that work that was being done here on French territory for a French client or person that was benefiting from that in France, that was not paying social charges on that work. So it was almost as if the person was skirting French social charge law to be paid out of America, and that could theoretically catch up to you. And as your immigration lawyer, I cannot advocate. Voila. And then you've got Adrian's answer. So.
I like you even more.
Yeah, Marco.
Early on, you mentioned that the French government, the naturalization officials aren't impressed by someone who says, I want to become a naturalized French citizen because I'm living my dream. I've always dreamed of living in France. So if that isn't, I mean, that makes sense that it shouldn't matter, okay? But what does matter to them?
Great question. So when you try to file to get naturalized, the first question they usually pose you is, why do you want to become French? It's like when, what was the younger Kennedy brother?
Bobby?
Not Bobby,
Robert.
but the other, Ted Kennedy. Yeah, Ted, when he ran for president and he was like the front runner, and then they asked him, why do you want to become president? And he gave such a bad answer that he lost the primary and is not our president. So that's the first question, and it's a question to get right, is to say, like, why do you want to become French? And it's good to say that, if your family's here, that your family is here, if you have a job, that the job is here, that you see yourself here, this is where you've established your life and where you'll be going forward here, and lastly, that you want to vote in this country. Those are all the right answers. And that last part about voting is the civic side of things. They love that civics.
They love that, yeah.
And so the bad answers that I've heard is to say that I can't wait to move to a different country in the EU, and that it's once I get my French passport, I'll be able to do so, because they want you to be here, right? Like if you're trying to be a candidate for France, it's because, as we were saying earlier on, about they have such a high opinion of themselves, that if you want to become French, you have to work for it. They're going to make you pay for it. So you put in the time by the 5 years presence, you put in the time by the year and a half it takes by getting the criminal background check and the language test and all that, putting that all together, and then the in-person appointment, which Adrian's going to rock when she has her naturalization, because it's oral and because she knows, France like the back of her hand by now. That's those kinds of answers that she wants to see.
You talk about the interview?
Yeah, the in-person interview.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Oh, I know about that. Oh, I've got a good feeling. Because they're going to ask questions that you've known because you've been here for so long. So that's why you're going to hit it out of the park. I'm not worried about you.
Yeah, but I can't sing the Marseillaise.
You can start studying the Marseillaise.
I have to.
Yeah. Yes?
This is a pretty basic question for anybody that's going to an appointment at the prefecture.
Yeah.
But certain documents you have to provide, marriage certificates, birth certificates, they have to be translated.
Yeah.
And in my experience, at least, I had to pay to get it translated every year, even though the basic document never changed. Can you explain why that is, or what the rule is?
It depends on the prefecture. Most prefectures nowadays are happy with any translation, and it doesn't have to be dated in time, except if you're getting married in France. So the general rule.
Does it have to be certified?
By certified, I want to say written by a French sworn translator, who then put their French sworn translation stamp on it. So they're not going to accept the sworn translator for a guy in Los Angeles because they don't know how to trust that person, versus a sworn translator here in France swore in front of a French appellate court. So they know they can trust that person and their translation. They're not going to, bidonner and just n'importe quoi. And then, generally speaking, it's the first time you file, they ask for your birth certificate and marriage certificate, because they get that into their system and then they saved it and they don't ask for it again. Although that can be on the 10-year card checklist. They might want to see it. So they want to see it. It's good to have it. Once you have it, you bring it. But in my experience, they don't give you trouble if it's an older translation. Yeah?
When I got my 10-year card, it was after a series of renewals of the visitor visa.
Sure.
And I actually think it was done a little after 4 years. It wasn't actually 5 years, but it was 5 renewals because there was some screw up, where I had 2 of these things in the course of the year. In any case, eventually because I was getting along fine with my agent, who loved the United States and Americans and all that kind of stuff. We were having a great conversation, and I said, oh, by the way, when can I apply for the 10-year card? And he said, I told him, and I looked at his computer, and he told him, you can apply next year. I said, he told me, what I had to do was apply like I was applying for the regular visitor visa, so get my appointment. but then I would send through registered mail a lettre de motivation.
Okay.
Explaining why I think I should be in France for 10 years, why I should be getting the 10-year card.
Sure.
I never heard anything back other than receiving confirmation that the letter
Yeah,
had been
accusé de
received.
réception, yeah.
And that was actually a case where I basically said, my bottom line, I wrote this in French on my own. I tried to get friends to help me. I said, screw it, they're not helping me. I'm just going to write myself. And he said, I feel like this is home.
Yeah.
That was sort of my bottom line. And I had no idea. Went in with the stuff for my visitor visa. They told me, oh no, you're here for the 10-year card.
Okay.
But you know, so you need these documents in addition to what you've already provided. They gave me a week to come back with those documents.
Okay.
But I'm wondering, you know, is it still the case that you essentially need to trigger the 10-year card by saying, can I finally get the 10-year card? And is the process a little bit smoother on that, or are they a little more organized?
So they're still not organized about how to get the 10-year card. So what I generally advise to my clients is to try to trigger it. Now, I've heard it and I've seen it where the agent on his own, her own will say, by the way, I think that you could qualify for the 10-year card. You know, if you send me this, that, and the other, we can get that in motion. So they can be, you know, generous, but they're not always going to do that. So as you said, you do it in the framework, generally speaking, of a renewal for your visitor status. You show all those documents, and then plus taxes and level of A2. I'm not sure why the agent had you write them a specialized letter, because it didn't sound like that actually brought anything about. They're not always experts
well,
in
the only thing I'll say about that is that I think by sending that, they put me into a different category, but they didn't inform me that I'd been put into a different category.
I might have been able to see that if I saw your convocation. Usually at the bottom it says what kind of thing you're there for.
No.
But in any event, yeah, you generally have to, you kind of have to trigger, you kind of have to get their attention. Once the NF website has the 10-year card as an option on it, it'll be straightforward, like it'll be clear. And until that date comes, you still have to kind of knock on their door. Weirdly enough, right now, because it's not on the website, the way to do it is you fill in the NF visitor renewal, and you ask in the comment box at the end, please cancel my application, and send me an in-person appointment. And then they do that, a convocation comes, and then you go to the in-person appointment with all your documents of paper, and you hand it over, and then they tell you if you got it or not the day of. You were saying that...
That's what you suggested I do, and I wrote that in. I canceled the request for my one-year renewal, and I hereby, because I understand that I qualify for the 10-year card, and I hope very much that I will be a candidate for that.
Yeah.
And then I showed up with my letter of motivation right there.
Yeah, well, yeah. And then when I did that, the rule of thumb for the 10-year card is being mostly in France. So the rule is 10 months over the past, no more than 10 months spent abroad over the past 5 years, and no more than a 6-month chunk spent abroad. So roughly no more than 2 months a year outside of France. I went with one of my clients who's a retired priest to get the 10-year card, and he spent 2.5 months every year in America. And in spite of that, he still got the 10-year card. He still walked out of there with the récépissé for the 10-year card and the right to work for the first time in France. And so they can check it, but they don't always check it, because that's an extra level of homework that they're not always going about doing and getting. Yeah?
I found it really helpful to try and say, oh, this is to get the tenure. To say, it's my fault because my French isn't good enough. Oh no, madame, that's not it. Oh no. Next year, you'll get it. Rather than
Okay.
just every day, 1 hour. I promise my French will be so good next time.
And I think that has to do with what you were saying was like the human approach, trying to show your humanity to the agent so that they then can be favorable. Because they can write little notes in your little online fichier, your little online profile.
Well, plus, when you put yourself in their hands, they want to take care of you.
And
it's all part of the culture.
And that's actually how I approach it. So when I hire staff, what I have foreign staff and I've got French staff, but what oftentimes when people are applying as they're French, they say, okay, I have a little mock situation. Like, you filed for this visa, and you person clearly deserved it, but they didn't get it. The prefecture, the consulate made a manifest error. Please write a nice email to the consulate to let them know. And my French, candidates for the job will always say, like, how dare you? Like, this is like so erroneous. And then the foreigners who work for me, who write this kind of messages, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that, and it's called what I call like inviting them to see, but not without necessarily asking them to do something. So you make them aware of the situation, and then if they decide in their grace to be good to you, then it's on their own will. and maybe that's human nature more than French government, but that's at least my strategy as
No,
it comes
it's
to
French nature.
It might be French nature. So I invite them to be good to me, and I make them aware of the situation without necessarily insisting that they do it, because then I'm not forcing their hand, and then they could choose to be good to me in return. Yeah.
So is it better to do in person to get your 1-year status renewed for 1 year? Is it better to do it in person?
So
Is it better to do it online?
the question is it better to renew it in person or online? And they won't let you do it in person anymore. So as of September of 2021, it now has to go online. And then, of course, if you're not following every different change in the prefecture like I am, you're unaware. And so then maybe one of your colleagues in Nice filed it by paper, and then that's not the way it was going for a year. And so then it was a bit of a fiasco because you're not doing it in the way that they want you to be doing, but you're not aware it changed because you've been here for X number of years. So, yeah. Yeah.
So after you've been here, you've renewed it 5 separate years in a row, then you have to actually get an appointment to try to get the 10-year card? You have to actually physically go there?
It depends on what the filing process is for how to actually get the 10-year card. Some prefectures, you have to go online to get the appointment. Some you have to write them an email, and they'll give you an appointment. Some you have to mail them the whole case file by registered letter. So this is why it's not easy for me to give like a one good solid answer. And I would love for my job to be easy, but it's not.
The 10-year card is not an online.
It's not currently online, and with some help, it'll be online in a year's time or so. And then at that point, it should be straightforward.
Just be thankful you're not doing this in Italy.
Oh, I'm thankful. It's in Italy.
No, because in Italy, every region has its own different rules.
I mean, that feels like how France is too, though. So I went down to do the 10-year, spouse and EU national application in Nice, and for a different client, we filed 6 months prior. It was approved, and then they canceled it just like that because he was on an Airbnb. So I went down with him to do the filing, and we were received by the head of service, the chef de service. And then the guy says to me, "That'll be a 50 euro fee." And I said, "What do you mean 50 euro fee? That's the late fee." And he says, "Yeah, the regularisation fee." And I said, "My guy's not regular. There's no late fee to apply." And we had this back and forth about, well, he needed to have gotten this visa from abroad. And I said, that visa doesn't exist abroad. You can't have a spouse and EU national visa as an American. That doesn't even exist. We had this back and forth, and I said, I'm not trying to contradict you, but that's not how they do it in Paris. And he says, "Monsieur, c'est pas Paris. On est à Nice."
Oh yes, pas Paris. No.
And then, yeah. So I paid the 50 euros then, and I took an L. And then I went out of the prefecture. I went to the restaurant across the street, and I'm a vegetarian, so I got an omelet. And I said to them, I see you've got potatoes over here for this like fish dish, but I don't eat fish. Can I have an omelet with potatoes? And he goes, "No, monsieur." And I said,
"C'est pas possible."
He said, "Pas possible." And I said, "But you do have potatoes, right?" And he goes, "Yes, for our fish dish." And I said, "But could I have some potatoes in my omelet?" And he says, "No, there's a penury of potatoes. Like we don't have enough potatoes." And I said, "That's what you're saying? I will accept it. Okay, I'll take an omelet, please." And then 20 minutes later, the dish comes out, an omelet with potatoes. So I made him aware of my desire. I did not insist upon it, and he treated me cordially. He gave me what I was asking for. What was I talking about?
Those are the rules. Those were the rules.
So, so there's going to be slight variations.
Too funny.
Voila.
We have 3 minutes. We could stay longer if you want, but if you want to
so
try to wrap it up.
Sure. So I'll be right here afterwards. I have cards in case you need to get my cards. Otherwise, if you just Google my name, Daniel Tostado, you can find me. I've got a well-established website, and I reply quickly. But otherwise, it was a pleasure to speak with you all, and I look forward to being in contact with every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Don't do it on your own. Okay, if you can help it. William had problems. Okay.
You could.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll see you next month. Okay, same time, same place, second Tuesday.